Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the first lecture. It's kind of a mini lecture. We'll basically just be going over the introductory reading for the class, which deals with applying social psychology. Now, the reading comes from a textbook that approaches applied social psychology in a more traditional sense than what we're going to do in this class, but I still think that this chapter and this reading is useful, and it's applicable to what we're going to do in this class, even if we're going to approach it in a more, say, holistic or focus more on current events, what's going on in our society at the moment now. So, what exactly is applied social psychology? Well, you can ask yourself, is it possible that social psychology can help us solve societal problems? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. We can use social psychology in helping to solve societal issues. And that's really what applied social psych is all about, using social psychological theories, research findings, what we know about social psychology, and applying that to real world type of problems. So social psychology is a basic science, but it's very easily applied, right? So it's a basic science in the sense that the goal of social psychology is to understand how humans think, feel, and behave in social situations. The goal is not necessarily to solve the world's problems or to solve societal issues. The goal is to understand humans and human nature, right? Particularly in social contexts, in social situations. So even though it's a basic science, we're constantly building on what we know about humans and how we interact and affect one another. And we can use that information to try to make some changes in society. So many, if not most, societal problems have social psychological aspects. So you could think some clear examples are things like crime and racism and destruction of our environment, and all of the topics that we will be talking about during this semester. All of these are societal issues that we're going to examine using social psychological aspects. So social psychology may not only help in clarifying these problems, helping us to understand them, but social psychology can also help contribute to finding solutions. That's kind of where we're not gonna touch upon too much in this class, because it would take forever, right? There's no easy fix to any of these societal problems. This class is going to focus more on clarifying or understanding these social issues that are laid out in the syllabus. Okay, so one popular approach often taken when it comes to applied social psychology is what's known as the PATH model, right, or the PATH method. So the PATH method offers a systematic, easy-to-use methodology for applying social psychological theories to help tackle a whole bunch of different social issues. So we'll go through each one of these steps, each one of these what's the word I'm looking for? Steps is fine. We'll go through each one of these in more detail, but just to lay it out what this acronym stands for. The first is problem. This is identifying and defining the problem. We'll see what exactly that entails in a minute here. Analysis, formulating appropriate concepts and developing theory-based explanations. Test, developing and testing an explanatory process model. And finally, help, which is developing and evaluating a program of interventions. So let's take a look a little further into the first step, defining the problem. So arriving at an adequate problem definition requires a lot of consideration and a lot of deliberation to try to really understand what it is we're dealing with. So often there's just a general feeling within a team of researchers or a community or an organization that there's a problem, and that something must be done, even though we're not really sure what exactly is the problem, right? It's just an overall things are not right. Something's wrong here. So the first step is, once we identify what it is that is wrong, we then have to actually define what it's wrong. We have to know what it is we're working with, right? So it's very important to identify, but then describe precisely what the problem is. Also, we need to describe why is it a problem at all, right? Why is this even an issue? And for whom is this a problem? Who is this problem affecting? What are some of the main causes of the problem? And the population, the group of people that we want to target with our interventions once we develop them. And this is known as the target group. We'll do an example later on towards the end of this lecture with a real-world type of example dealing with the issue of HIV/AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so in terms of the problem, defining the problem, once we've identified it, once we've defined it, final step is to take a look at what's known as the quote-unquote key aspects of the problem that need to be considered. So a good problem definition makes clear that the problem has an applied rather than a basic nature, meaning that we're going to define the problem in such a way that it's solvable, that we're able to offer some type of intervention. If not solvable, then at least we can help with the problem. We have to also make sure that the problem is formulated in concrete terms. This goes back to Intro to Social Psych, when we spoke about a lot of what psychologists, a lot of the things that we study are conceptual. You can't really put somebody on a scale and measure how much happiness they have, right? You can't really, there's no blood test for determining how much love someone has. So a lot of times we deal with constructs or conceptual type of issues, variables that we're interested in studying. So what do we have to do in order to study those constructs? Well, we have to develop what's known as operational definitions. We have to define, for our purposes, happiness means X, Y, and Z, right? And X, Y, and Z, you better be able to measure those things. So we need to be able to, again, formulate our problem in concrete terms that are measurable. Also, the problem should have social, psychological aspects to it. So that should kind of make sense, right? Since we're in applied social psych class. And as I said before, we have to, if we're going to be applying social psychology to a societal problem in order to intervene or to help solve it, then the problem has to be solvable, right? Or it has to be an issue that we are able to intervene to help, right? Okay, so social psychological factors, of course, include behavior, attitudes, cognition, affect, motivational responses. So we're not going to, if we're going to be addressing a societal problem, it's going to, again, focus on these social psychological aspects. So it's going to focus more on the individual, not necessarily what we can do in the community or what laws that we can enact necessarily, but more so how can we affect these components, these factors, people's behaviors, people's attitudes, their cognitions, their motivations, or affects. Those are the things that we would be interested in changing or helping in order to help address this societal problem. So when the problem cannot be defined along one or more of these terms, or these factors is probably not suited for this path approach. It's probably not suited for an applied social psychological approach. Maybe that problem is best solved using a sociological approach, or an economics approach, or who knows, right? Something else. But those are the things that we would be interested in as applied social psychologists. Okay, step 2, analysis and explanation. So once the problem has been defined in terms of one or more social psychological constructs, the next step is to come up with a social psychological explanation for the problem. So we kind of defined it in a social psychological way. Now we have to understand, why is this problem happening? What's causing this to be a problem? So before we can do this, we have to decide what the outcome variable is going to be. Essentially, what is the variable that is going to need changing? So this is, it's a little inaccurate to say before we can explain that we need to know what the outcome variable is. They kind of go hand in hand. Before we could have a full explanation, though, we really do need to know what ultimately our goal is, right? What is it that we want to change? What is it that we're going to do? But this tends to go back and forth. Your outcome variable is going to change. It might get more and more refined the more analysis that you're doing, right? So when we talk about analysis, the first thing that we're going to do once we've defined our problem is go hit PsycInfo, or hit one of the other psychological or even behavioral databases there to go review the scientific literature. What do we already know about this problem, right? What do we know about how people respond to this problem, how they act in regarding this problem? So this is basically that research step that we're going to do. That, not research, literature review part of the intervention here. So through analysis, going through the scientific literature, that outcome variable is going to change, or at least be refined. But yeah, it's going to be really hard for you to go do a literature search if you don't have some idea of what that outcome variable is going to be, because where the hell do you start, right? Where are you going to start in terms of reviewing the literature? So you need an outcome variable, at least an idea of one, before you get going. Okay, so once we develop this, or once we've analyzed the scientific literature, we're starting to do some analyses here. We're going to want to develop a process model. So the process model is going to be based on the variables that we've uncovered in that previous stage. So all the things that we learned about our problem, and about a potential solution for the problem, those variables, the different studies that we were looking at, those should all be included within this model. Now, I said they all should be, but we'll see probably not all of them. That can become unwieldy. That can become kind of meaningless when you try to explain everything. But this model includes our outcome model, or our outcome variable, rather. So these are the different steps and the different variables that we're going to be paying attention to in order to reach that outcome that we're seeking. So the model should primarily contain variables that can be influenced, so things that are within our control. So I say within our control as applied researchers, but this would be more likely in terms of if we were acting as activists, community activists, or if we were part of an organization, a nonprofit or government organization that is looking to solve a particular problem. The things that we want to include in our model should primarily be things that we're able to change or influence. Otherwise, there's not going to be much use for this model if it only includes variables that are beyond our control. So, as I said before, we probably don't want to include every variable that we encountered, or every variable that we found to be part of this problem during the second stage, the analysis stage, because too many variables, again, can make the model unworkable in a sense, right? There's only so much that you can actually do. So when we include too many variables or too many relationships, we're not really going to we might not ever make it to that outcome variable if we're too busy trying to control all of these things. So like a good hypothesis, right? A good theory anyway. A good theory shouldn't try to explain everything. In social sciences, we tend to prefer a lot of smaller theories rather than, say, a theory of everything, right? A theory of everything doesn't really help us understand the issue very well. If everything could be related back to cognitive dissonance, just say as an example, okay, well, that might explain some things better than others, but if everything's cognitive dissonance, then basically nothing's cognitive dissonance. The theory's not really helping us in that way. So it's important to choose the variables and the relationships for your model that are going to be the most helpful. In, again, by the time we're at stage 3, we're trying to get to stage 4, right? We're trying to get to that outcome variable. So include the things that are going to help us move along and get to that final stage. Okay, so here's just an example of what a process model might look like. This one asks, what determines the general public's willingness to donate money for people with HIV and AIDS in Africa? So you can see several different variables that are included in here. So one here, the degree to which one perceives HIV/AIDS as a preventable disease. And from that, we see the degree to which one attributes HIV/AIDS among people in Africa to carelessness. And from there, we have the degree to which one perceives the fate of people with HIV/AIDS in Africa as being justified. And you can see, if I move my mouse here, we also have another variable that comes into play, belief in a just world. Right? And this is a social psychological theory or concept here. People who believe in a just world believe that people kind of get what they deserve ultimately, that the world is just. It's a just and fair place. So we see how somebody's belief in a just world might affect the degree to which they perceive the fate of people who have HIV and AIDS in Africa as being justified. And it might affect the degree to which one feels that oneself and or someone they love could be infected with HIV. If you have a belief in a just world, you're less likely to think that you're going to get, say, HIV or AIDS in this example, or someone you love will get HIV/AIDS. Why? Well, because I'm a good person, and the people in my family are good people, and bad things only happen to bad people, right? This might actually explain why some people don't believe coronavirus is this pandemic is as significant or detrimental as it is, why they're not worried about it. We should take a look at where they would score on a just world beliefs scale. Okay, so we see a number of different variables in here. I won't, you can read, so I won't show or go through each of these here. But you can see that there's some circular relationships that exist within these models, and they can go, in many different directions and have different types of relationships. Sometimes the relationships between these variables can go both ways. So again, we'll see an example of using this path model in a moment here, actually dealing with this very topic, people's willingness to donate money to people with HIV/AIDS in Africa. Okay, so once we got a model going here, the final step, that help stage or help step, excuse me, is creating an intervention. So not only is this the final step, it's often the most difficult. Not just because of the logistics involved, but also securing the money, the funding, and not just the money, but the people power necessary to actually implement this intervention. This can be really hard, really difficult. It can take years to get this thing going. So it's the final and often the most difficult step, and that's to move from the process model to an actual intervention program. It's important that the model contains primary factors that can be influenced through intervention. We already said that, right? We want to include things in that model that we can actually change, that we can actually do. Now, changing somebody's belief in a just world, that can be difficult, right? So that might be maybe lower on our priority. Maybe there's some things within that model that will be easier for us to do, easier for us to create an intervention for in order to reach that outcome variable, which is to get people to donate money, right? So we said that it's important to include things that we can influence, and when we first come up with as many interventions as possible, we have to understand that not all of these interventions are going to be created equal, right? So we're first going to come up with as many possible interventions that we can think of that are based on our analyses that we've created these models for. We're ultimately going to have to pick one or two, maybe a handful of interventions that are going to have the most promise at reaching that outcome variable. So also we say creating an intervention, but also part of this is deciding on which intervention to go with. We usually have several potential paths or potential interventions. We're going to have to weigh the pros and cons of each. So often this intervention will contain some type of behavioral training, some type of education or information or an awareness type of program. Sometimes it can involve trying to get certain laws passed. And you might say, well, what do laws have to do with, social psychology? Isn't that more like a sociological or a legal type of approach? Oh, yeah, it can. But sometimes, particularly when it comes to issues like discrimination, right? We might not be able to easily change people's feelings about other groups of people. That might take a long time, a lot of training, a lot of education, a lot of awareness. But what we can change is how people treat those marginalized groups. We can make discrimination illegal, right? So critics of anti-discrimination laws will often say, well, you can't force people to like blacks or Hispanic or Latino people or gay people. Like, no, you can't. You can't force people to like them at all. You can't force people to like anybody, right? But we can force you to treat everyone equally, or to at least punish you when you don't treat people equally, right? So that's what anti-discrimination laws are targeted towards. the behavioral component, the behavioral aspect of those social psychological factors that we were talking about. So, are anti-discrimination laws good enough? I mean, it depends. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But, I mean, take a look at, we've had anti-discrimination laws in this country. You can't discriminate against people on the federal level based on race and gender, national origin, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender identity. You can still discriminate legally based on those characteristics. But we've had anti-discrimination laws in place, and black people are still suffering in this country. Women still face discrimination in this country, but those laws help at least, right? And we know that they help. It's not just my opinion, right? The data shows that they help to create a fairer environment. We're still going to be dealing with it, but at least there are legal ramifications, potential legal ramifications for discrimination. Sorry, went off on a little bit of a legal tangent there. I teach psychology and the law, so shameless plug. I'll be teaching 2 sections of that in the fall if you're still around. So you'll forgive me if I go off on legal tangents sometimes. Okay, so the intervention will contain some of these social psychological interventions or factors, and shaping the intervention. We need to shape the intervention in such detail that we can actually implement it. Now that, again, usually takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy and creativity, and I would say a lot of patience to do. Yes, you often run into tons of red tape and tons of roadblocks whenever you're trying to make any type of change. And humans in general tend to be resistant to any kind of change. It's something we'll talk about when we review reactance theory. Okay, give me 1 second here. Sorry. Okay, so what are some of the potential problems with applying social psychological theories to social issues? Well, number one, it's definitely not always easy to apply social psych theories to social problems. Sometimes it's not clear that there's a connection there. Sometimes it's not clear that a social problem actually has a potential social psychological cause or aspect to it. So again, for this class, that's pretty much what we're going to be focusing on, the social problems that exist out there, and we're going to be examining the potential social psychological elements to those problems. So most general knowledge in social psychology is derived from laboratory studies. If you remember from your methods class, and pretty much every class that you take in psychology has at least a chapter on it, a chapter in that class that deals with research methods. So, laboratory studies are the gold standard. Why? Because, again, we're a basic science. We're there to try to understand humans, right? That's what we do ultimately. So, how do we do this? Well, through the scientific method, which laboratory studies gives us a whole lot of experimental control and gives us a whole lot of reliability or validity, internal validity at least. We're able to control a whole lot of factors to really get down to the issue that we're most interested in studying. The problem with that, and we'll talk about each one of these in a moment here, there's lots of problems with laboratory studies, we know, but 3 major limitations potentially, or especially as we're trying to apply this knowledge that we gained inside a laboratory to actually solving a societal problem. The first is oversimplification, the second is external validity, and third, contradictory evidence. Let's take a look at each one of these in a little bit more detail here. So, oversimplification. By definition, the situations that are examined in experiments in laboratories are reductionists, and they're simplifications of reality, right? People don't live in laboratories, and people don't live having experimenters examining them or observing their behaviors. And even when we try to make something more realistic in a lab, people still know that it's a simulation. When I do mock trial research, or I do jury decision-making research, people know that they're not in a real trial, right? They know that they're not serving as actual jurors, no matter how much I want them to think that, no matter how much I try to make the experience as realistic as possible, given the money and the space and resources I have. So that what we get from a laboratory is not necessarily what we're going to get in the real world. A single lab experiment can never examine the complex interplay of variables that affect human social behavior in the real world. So once we start getting dozens and hundreds of laboratory studies, we can become more confident that might be how humans act in the real world. But you'll see for our next limitation of external validity, we're not always going to be 100% sure, right? But if you come across, a single study that shows something, and this goes not just for social psych, this goes for pretty much anything, right? Any type of study in any field, a single study is really not worth much. Again, once we're getting into the dozen, if you could replicate it, now we're on to something. If you got two that show the same thing. If you get three, okay, now we're getting even more interested. More interested in what you have to say. But, we have to understand that the type of research that we do is really just oversimplification of the real world out there. So although researchers can include a second, a third, or even a fourth variable, and I would say you can include as many variables as you want in your experiment, ultimately it'll become impossible to manage that study. But even if you can include multiple variables, it's not possible to include all the variables that can potentially be relevant to our problem. So we must assess what are the most important variables to include in our research and also in our process model. We saw, we're going to come across a whole lot of studies that show a whole bunch of different variables that are affecting that outcome variable that we're interested, the variable we're interested in changing. We could kind of think of it as like a dependent variable, but we're not doing a study here. We're trying to do a social intervention. We're going to have to choose the most important variables. Okay, so the oversimplification is related to this idea of external validity. So there are endless factors in the real world that can impact the variables that are manipulated in our research. So we're never getting a full picture with the research that we're conducting. It's kind of impossible to do. So a lot of these variables can't even be controlled in a laboratory setting, right? The best we can do is account for them, right? So you think about, I don't know, because some of these variables you're just never going to even include in your study. Why? Because you only have a certain amount of time, with your participants, a certain amount of time to do this research, and life just doesn't work that way, right? Life is really complicated, and the interactions that happen between people, the experiences that we have had in our lives, the experiences that make us who we are, how can we account for all of that in a laboratory study? You can't really, right? We could count for maybe 2 or 3 in this study, and then maybe a couple more in another study, and so on and so forth. But we're never really going to get a full picture there. So despite the striking results of some experiments, in real life, the success of certain interventions might actually be weak. The interventions might not work, even though you'd say, how come this is not working? All the research shows that it should, right? Well, the research has been done in the lab, and you're trying to make an intervention for people in the real world, which is always changing, and at the moment, batshit crazy, right? No one knows what the hell is going on out there. So your interventions might not always work, or if they do, they might not work as well as you're anticipating. Also, there might be some serious ethical concerns in terms of how your intervention is being implemented. Let's say, for example, again, just as an example, hypothetically speaking, if we were able to use hypnosis to change somebody's mind about, say, if we were able to get rid of prejudice by unconsciously hypnotizing people without their knowledge, well, would that be cool? Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a world without prejudice? Would that be ethical? Absolutely not. I would never advocate that we would ever do such a thing, or even think about doing such a thing, right? So you can't do things without people's consent, and you can't do harm. And you can say, well, getting rid of prejudice, how in the world is that harmful? Yeah, well, you're going in there scrambling people's brains, and maybe you messed something else up when you were up there getting rid of the prejudice through hypnosis. So again, that's kind of a silly example, but kind of gives you an idea of some of the potential for, let's say, unethical concerns that might come up. Okay, finally mentioned in one of the major limitations of applying social psychological research to social problems is that social psychological research often contradicts itself, right? For every study I can find saying one thing, I can find another that says the opposite, and probably a third that says something completely different than those other 2 studies, and so on and so forth. So studies often produce contradictory findings, which can be confusing and difficult to interpret. And yeah, sometimes that will drive you crazy. You're like, how do I make sense of this, right? One of the things we're supposed to do is to address contradictory evidence, contradictory research findings when we're writing articles. You kind of might want to set that up in your literature review. Then you run your study, and now you have to tell the reader, you have to put in your article, how do your results from this study that you just completed, that you just found, how do they square up with what other people have found? Well, if other people have found wildly different things, it could be a real pain in the ass, like trying to make sense of where your findings fit in, especially if it's a topic where there's a lot of contradictory evidence, a lot of contradictory results. So researchers are frequently able to reconcile these different findings. We could do that by taking a look at the methodologies that were used. So maybe these two findings or these two studies on the same topic, maybe they're showing different results because they used a different way of measuring their dependent variable, or maybe they manipulated the independent variable differently, or maybe this study failed to include this important confounding or this important mitigating variable, right? Maybe this study did a weird statistical analysis that showed there's an effect when, this better, more stringent statistical analysis is the one they should have used, and maybe they wouldn't have found an effect if they used this analysis instead of that analysis, so on and so forth. But no matter how much we do that, no matter how much we go looking for what might be causing these differences in results, we're not going to be able to explain them all away. So there's always going to be some differences there. Again, humans are complicated, right? And we change. We're in a social psych class, so I can say this, right? From a social psychological perspective, our behaviors, our thoughts, our emotions are really largely dictated by the environment or the particular situation that we're in right now. Now, I teach personality psychology, and I have to be careful not to diss on it too much, right? Personality psychology says, no, we're kind of a certain way, and we're kind of always that way, and there could be certain changes, and maybe in certain environments or situations we might change a little bit, but ultimately we're still really this kind of way. Social psych says, nope, we are that way in that situation, and we could be another way, in a totally different situation. So, we have to keep that in mind. So from a broader perspective, seemingly contradictory findings support the idea that, exactly what I just said, that humans are really complex social beings, and we have a lot of different behavioral tendencies, and those can come out depending on the given situation. So, am I introverted? Am I extroverted? Really depends. Really depends on who I'm with and in what kind of situation. Typically, not big on going out or anything, but that's probably because I'm old, right? When I was younger, we were going to raves and punk shows and all that stuff, and that was totally much more extroverted and all that. And I can be extroverted now. It's just, getting me out of the house is going to be the biggest obstacle. So I'm totally introverted until I'm out. Once I'm amongst people and stuff, then I kind of, I'm in my zone at that point, which is why teaching online is really odd, and why I don't think I'm as good of a lecturer when I'm not lecturing to nobody. There's a little dot on my laptop that I'm looking at right now. I need an audience. I need people to laugh at my stupid, corny jokes, and people to, start nodding off so I know when to move on, or the all-important head shake, right? Your professors need this. They need this. Why? This means we understand. Move on, right? And then if you get a head shake accompanied by one of these or it's like, okay, we got it. Now you're boring us. So move along and make it interesting. So all that's gone now. So you'll forgive me. Then sometimes I'm like, some of these lectures, I'm like, how? Okay. Let's do an example, instead of me ranting or going off on a tangent here. Let's do an example of a social let's take a look at this path model, let's say. in how it might work in the real world. So let's say we have this problem. There's a debilitating prevalence of HIV/AIDS in Africa, and there's a debilitating lack of support for HIV/AIDS victims in Africa. So we know that this is a problem, right? So we see it. It's in the stats, but we really need to go in there and formulate a problem definition. So what do we mean by debilitating prevalence? What is the actual prevalence? How does this compare with other parts of the world? What are some of the issues that we might want to examine as to what's causing this type of high prevalence rate? When we talk about lack of support for HIV/AIDS victims, what exactly do we mean by that, right? Are we talking about a lack of medical support? Are we talking about a lack of social support, family support, community support, economic support, so on and so forth? So step one, formulating a problem definition. An example of this might be understanding that in 2005, around 26 million people in sub-Saharan Africa were infected with HIV. That's a huge number. It makes up, in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, up to 25% of the population has HIV/AIDS, right? We can also say why. So, okay, who cares? So 26 million people are infected. Why is that necessarily a problem? Well, because HIV/AIDS is still an incurable disease that deeply affects the lives of people who are involved. Not just the people who have HIV/AIDS, but people who love them and who take care of them, their families, their communities. It's still an incurable disease. And of course, there are treatments now that can vastly extend people's lives and vastly improve their quality of life. But people with HIV/AIDS still, even with the medications today, have on average lower lifespans, and they're more susceptible to a host of opportunistic infections still. And the medications that are used to treat HIV/AIDS can have some really nasty effects on the body. So it's still a serious disease. It's still a serious illness, and that's why it's still a problem, right? So more than any disease, HIV/AIDS is surrounded by taboos that often lead to stigmatization and isolation of patients. So we're starting to get into the lack of support here, and also we're starting to narrow down a little bit who our target population is, or at least one of the populations that of interest to us, right? So the people who are suffering or people who are living with HIV/AIDS face a whole bunch of stigmatization, right? It's still largely associated with gay sex, and in other countries, say more Western countries, IV drug use, right? But mostly it's still stereotypically associated with gay men, or men who have sex with other men, which is not true. So the willingness to donate money to help and support people with HIV/AIDS has decreased over the past 20 years. And there, we can talk about some of the reasons why that has happened. Part of it is that people don't see HIV/AIDS as being as serious as it once was. And, there's an argument to be made that, again, lifespans and quality life are improving. New medications coming out. we keep hearing about a potential vaccine, so maybe people think, okay, it's not as bad as it was. But that's in this country, and it's still not wonderful in this country. But it's absolutely devastating in some of the countries in Africa, and in other places of the world. But Africa in particular, 25% prevalence rate in some areas is pretty alarming, right? So we might again be starting to get into the idea here, like how do we get people to fund or donate to help fight HIV/AIDS? Again, coming from, we're still in this area of trying to understand the problem, trying to define it. A team of volunteers from the National HIV/AIDS Foundation might wish to set up a campaign to raise funds to provide medical and psychological care for people with HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. So this might be what they intend to do. They're starting to say, well, this is our plan now, right? So some volunteers argue, this is all again an example here, so some volunteers argue that the campaign should not be too dramatic. Other volunteers argue that because of the lack of media interest in HIV/AIDS, the campaign should highlight the severe and incurable nature of the disease. All right, this is something they're going to have to resolve by going to the literature. What does the research suggest? What approach do they suggest, right? Typically speaking, if you're going to use an emotional type of message, you have to, or even a fear-based type of message. We know that fear can work, but it only works if you give somebody a way for them to mitigate their fear, to get rid of their fear. So fear or an emotional plea could actually work in this case, because you would give somebody an opportunity to take that emotion down a couple notches. You can donate. You can donate to help fight HIV/AIDS. So this is why we've all seen those commercials for the ASPCA on the TV, and they usually put them in the middle of like comedy shows and things like that, sitcoms or what have you. So we're laughing and stuff, and then we see all these horrible images of animal cruelty, and it's a dramatic, unsettling campaign, and it's designed that way. But you can help. You feel like shit watching all these animals suffer, but you can feel better, right? All you have to do is go online and donate to help save these animals to feel better in this moment. And it works. It's successful. You might say, damn, that's pretty manipulative. Well, maybe. But that shit is happening. Those animals are suffering. And, if there's a way to raise awareness and raise money, then I certainly am not opposed to it. But, yeah, it's still tugging at people's heartstrings there. Sometimes you need to do that, though, right? So some volunteers might believe that the funds should be raised through people buying a product, like a bracelet. You see these charity bracelets a lot. And if they do this, these team or these volunteers are arguing, if we give out, like have them buy something, then it seems like it's a charity type of thing, right? So, and they're getting something in return, make them feel good about themselves. Again, go take a look at what the literature suggests about that. It's actually could work, could help to using the norm of reciprocity. I would say maybe personally, right, from what I know about these kind of things, it might actually be better to give somebody a bracelet and then ask them to donate. So then you put pressure on them to reciprocate. Give them that I support, I fight HIV, or whatever your slogan is going to be. Give that to the person first, and then if they accept it, then they'd be a pretty big asshole not to donate to your charity. Other people debate whether the slogan should be positive, something like stand up against AIDS, or something more dramatic like fight the horrors of AIDS. They'll have to work that out. Again, there's plenty of literature on how to frame that message, and what kind of techniques that you want to use. So it's all there, right? Just gonna have to do that in step 2. Okay, we also said that part of defining the problem is to identify where social psychology comes in. So there's an abundance of social psychological literature, research findings on people's willingness to donate money to charity. Like I said, there's tons of this stuff out there. All of those questions that were coming up amongst the volunteers, we have a lot of data out there for you to look at. Now remember limitations of this data, but from this literature, the team might come up with a specific suggestion, or suggestions, plural, on how to set up a fundraising campaign. So once they've identified the issue, who it's affecting, some potential things that they can do, they're going to hit the books, essentially. Well, in our case, you're going to have to hit the scientific literature, mostly peer-reviewed journal articles. After reviewing the literature, the team might define the problem. And again, just an example here. Results can vary or differ depending on the organization. They might define the problem as many people in Africa suffer from HIV/AIDS, and there's insufficient funding to provide adequate forms of medical and psychosocial help and support for these people. Which factors determine potential donors' willingness to donate money for this cause? How can we set up a campaign that would raise money to help people with HIV/AIDS in Africa? Pretty concrete, right? It's a pretty concrete questions there. And they're asking about the factors that determine a potential donor's willingness. Now, those factors, again, should be things that you can try to change. One factor, of course, is going to be the socioeconomic status of a potential donor. If they don't have money to donate to your cause, then there's nothing you're going to be able to do about that, right? So you're going to want to identify the things that you are able to change, or able to that you're able to influence, right? So keeping that in mind, you would move on to stage 2. Stage 2 in this example, well, we know stage 2 in general is the analysis and explanation stage. So what we might find during stage 2, again, some of these things we have mentioned, the different research that's going on here, or what different research has found, that the rates are incredibly high, the disease is still incurable, it's still highly stigmatized, things have been going down. I'm seeing here, I don't know what happened to the rest of the slides. I'm missing like 2 or 3 slides here, so I'll briefly just explain some of the other things that would come out of step 2. Step 2, they would evaluate the research and to determine whether positive messaging is more successful than, say, emotional type of messaging, or scary type of messaging. They would take a look to see whether or not giving a gift or having people purchase something and donating that money is more effective than just asking people for money and giving them a small gift or no gift in return. They will basically start to answer all of those different questions that were posed, or that were even posed in their definition, right? What are the factors? Well, that's what they will be trying to understand during step 2. Like I said, I don't know where my other slides are, but this process model that we looked at before actually is related to this study, this example rather. So this is what a process model might look like, right? We went through this before, but we see, there's some things in here. Again, belief in a just world. Maybe you can do something, right? If you're doing, say, an internet campaign or something along those lines, you can talk about how, 39% is it that I read of women in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, of pregnant women, are HIV positive, right? And then we can talk about how that, how HIV can be transmittable through to the child, right? How a child could be born with HIV. That might tap into somebody's idea in a just world. How can you possibly justify a child, literally like a newborn infant, having HIV? What the hell could they have done to quote unquote deserve that, right? So maybe hearing that as part of an awareness campaign might mitigate this, right? Maybe there are some ways to do that, at least help with this potential factor there. And typically, these type of fundraising campaigns are a hybrid of an awareness / fundraising campaign. So giving people an idea of how devastating this HIV/AIDS truly is in Africa and in other parts of the world is still, again, a major concern, major problem in the United States. But giving people an idea of how widespread it is, how harmful it continues to be, how it affects people that, you can't, in any, good conscience, blame for them having HIV/AIDS, right? We typically don't make people suffer for the sins of their parents here. So, there are a couple of things that you can do. Again, having this model here, though, is going to help guide the final stage. And again, I'll try to make sure that the slides, this PowerPoint is up to date, has the 2 or 3 slides on them. Make sure the full lecture is there. But when it comes to creating this type of intervention, pretty much like I said, maybe people will decide online is the best way to do this, and it will be done through social media. That we'll use Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and maybe we'll reach out to a couple of quote unquote influencers on social media sites to kind of direct people towards towards this awareness / fundraising campaign. And you give some information, some pertinent information that is going to help address some of these variables that we have identified as being important in what's going to help determine whether or not people contribute. So we'll provide the information that's going to tap into these types of variables, and we'll give them a really easy way to donate, right? So even now, sometimes
it's much easier if you're going to donate to a cause. A lot of people tend to do so a little more impulsively. So if they just watched some pretty tragic video or even an informative video, and there's a donate now, click right here. You could donate through PayPal that's already linked on your phone or something like that, rather than take out your credit card and type in all this stuff. People typically, the more steps that you have involved, the less likely people are going to do it. So, based on all that knowledge, what they've learned about what helps and hinders people's ability to or willingness to give, they're going to go ahead and apply that to their intervention. And part of that intervention, step 4, is not just doing it, right? Not just putting it out there and have it up and running, but also examining the effectiveness of it. And maybe making some changes, right? Seeing what's working and what's not working, and make some changes. But you definitely assess it, of course, to see how well your program worked or your intervention worked. But also to let others know, other people who want to do something similar in the future, what worked and didn't work. Okay, that's pretty much it for this lecture. Again, kind of a mini lecture, even though we're over an hour here. I would say what we're going to do for this class is basically just step 1 and 2 of this model. We're not really going to be creating this type of process model or any interventions here. We're going to be taking a look at social psychological problems, defining them through defining them or going through step 1, let's say, of this path model here, path process. And number 2, or stage 2, we'll do a little bit of that, but we're not going to be focusing too much on the scientific literature. So if anything, this class is more about step 1 of this whole process, right? Now, I promise I'll finish in 2 minutes here. How this class is typically taught, in say more traditional way, is that you're taught this model, right? Just as I have taught it, and during the class you might pick 2 or 3 kind of topics and actually go through each of these steps and come up with an intervention. And in some classes, you might actually be expected as like a final project to implement that intervention, maybe on campus or online or something like that. I take a little different approach because, as I mentioned in the syllabus, and as I mentioned on our first meeting, that I approach this class more from a critical thinking perspective. Before we get into, say, step 2 or step 3 or step 4, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening around us that we need to examine for, I think, our own health and for our society's health, for our own enlightenment, for our society's enlightenment, and my ultimate goal is to help us think critically about these events, and more specifically, think critically about what's going on out there in the world using the tools we have at our disposal, social psychological theories and research findings, but the emphasis will be on theory. With that said, excuse me, I've had this tickle in my throat I've been trying to suppress this whole time. But with that said, I look forward to our next meeting and our next lecture. So until then, have a great day.